The day I realized my mother-in-law hated my daughter, she was wearing Chanel No. 5 and a smile so wide it could have been carved into her face with a surgeon's blade. My name is Monica Rains, Monica Calloway before I married into the Rains family 6 years ago, and I live in a 4,000 square foot townhouse in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, the kind of address that makes women at school pickup tilt their heads and say, "Oh, wow," before they go home and Google your husband. My life looks good from the outside. Marble countertops, a Range Rover, a daughter named Sienna who has her daddy's eyes and my stubborn streak, and who has never done a single thing in her 5 years of life to deserve what happened to her on a Tuesday afternoon in October that I will never, not ever forget. We were at the Rains family estate in Vinings for Thanksgiving prep weekend. That's what they called it, prep weekend, as if the holidays were a military operation requiring a full 72 hours of pre-event logistics. My mother-in-law, Sylvia Rains, runs that estate like a CEO runs a hostile acquisition, with precision, charm, and a complete lack of mercy for anyone she considers beneath the operation. And for 6 years, I have smiled, poured wine, and pretended not to notice that Sylvia Rains has never once, not once, looked at my daughter the way she looks at her other grandchildren. But I didn't know how bad it really was, not until I found Sienna alone on the cold November pavement, crying with no one around her, like she had just been set down and forgotten the way you forget a grocery bag in the trunk of a car. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The sky over Atlanta was the color of a bruise, that gray-purple that comes right before the temperature drops hard. I had been inside helping Sylvia organize her holiday china, Royal Doulton, naturally, because nothing in that woman's house costs less than a semester of college, and I'd left Sienna with the other grandchildren in the backyard under what I was told would be supervised play. My sister-in-law, Camille, had agreed to watch them. Camille, who everyone in this family treats like she's made of spun gold, who laughs too loud and drinks too much rosé, and has never once in 6 years remembered my birthday. Camille had agreed, and Sylvia had nodded, and I had trusted them, because what else do you do in a family where trust is currency, and spending it wisely is the only game in town? I found out Sienna was alone because I heard her, a thin, high sound coming from the side of the house near the iron gate, that little hiccuping cry children make when they've been crying long enough that the tears have run out and only the sound is left. I put down the Doulton gravy boat I was holding, worth more than my first car, and I walked to the French doors and I looked out. The backyard was full. Sylvia's 3 other grandchildren were running around with sparklers someone had lit early, laughing, shrieking the way happy children shriek. Camille was there with a glass of wine in her hand, watching them with the easy satisfaction of a woman who feels completely at home. And nowhere in that picture was my daughter. I went around the side of the house, and there she was, Sienna, sitting on the stone pavement beside the driveway gate, her knees pulled up to her chest, her little patent leather shoes scuffed from sliding off something, her face a mess of dried tears and snot. Alone, completely and utterly alone. No adult nearby, no one checking on her, nothing. Just a 5-year-old child sitting on cold stone in 48-degree weather like she had been put there by someone who didn't expect anyone to notice. I scooped her up and I held her so tight she made a small surprised sound, and over her shoulder I stared at the lit windows of that house, and something inside me went very, very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means peace, the kind of quiet that means a decision has been made. "Mama," Sienna said into my neck, "Grandma Sylvia said I was bothering everybody and to go wait by the gate." I closed my eyes. I breathed and counted to 5 the way my therapist taught me when I was 23 and going through my parents' divorce and thought I was going to fall apart at the seams. Then I looked at my daughter's face and I asked her very calmly, very quietly, "And where was Aunt Camille, baby?" She said I was being annoying. She said it the way children say things they've absorbed from adults, flatly, almost confused, like she was repeating a phrase in a language she didn't fully speak yet. She said the big kids wanted to use the sparklers and I kept getting in the way. There it was, stripped down to its bones. My 5-year-old had been removed from the group, walked to the gate, told she was annoying, and left there like an inconvenience that needed to be parked somewhere out of sight. By my mother-in-law, by my sister-in-law, in a backyard full of adults who could see the side of the house from where they were standing and chose, every single one of them, to look the other way. What I did next surprised even me. I didn't go back inside. I didn't confront anyone. I carried Sienna to my car, I buckled her in, I put on her favorite Bluey episode on the backseat tablet, and I sat in the driver's seat with the engine running for 11 minutes. Because I needed those 11 minutes to figure out exactly what kind of woman I was going to be from this moment forward. My husband, Garrett Rains, had been inside with his brothers doing what Rains men do during prep weekend, drinking bourbon and talking about the real estate market with the particular satisfaction of men who have never once had to worry about money. Garrett is not a bad man. I want to make that clear, because what comes later will make you wonder. Garrett Rains is genuinely not a bad man. He loves Sienna. He loves me, in the way men love things that are theirs, with pride and protectiveness and absolutely no awareness of the infrastructure required to keep that thing functioning. He had no idea what was happening outside that gate because no one told him. That is the first and last defense I will offer on his behalf. I called him from the car. "Come outside," I said. Nothing else, just those 2 words, and something in my voice must have carried the weight of what I'd found, because he came out within 90 seconds, jacket still on, bourbon glass left behind, and he took one look at me sitting rigid in the driver's seat and at Sienna watching her cartoon in the back, and he said, "Monica, what happened?" I told him every word Sienna said. I told him about the pavement and the cold and the gate and 48 degrees and "you're annoying" and the sparklers and the 15 or 20 minutes that my child sat out there alone while his family was 30 feet away, choosing to leave her there. And I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. Every pleasant, well-bred, Rains family-approved expression he had ever worn stripped itself away, and what was left underneath was something raw and furious, and about 2 seconds from being very loud. He put his bourbon glass on the hood of my car, and he turned around, and he walked back into that house. And I want you to understand, I didn't follow him, because I already knew what I was going to do, and it was going to be so much worse than a confrontation. I heard him from the car. The Rains estate has those old southern windows, single pane, beautiful, absolutely useless at containing sound, and I heard Garrett's voice go from controlled to sharp to something that made the laughing in the backyard stop dead. I didn't hear the exact words, but I heard the silence that followed them. That particular silence that a room full of people makes when someone who has always played by the rules decides to stop. Camille came out first. She always runs from things first. I've noticed that about her over 6 years. She walks fast in heels, which is impressive, and also tells you everything about who she is. She passed my car without looking at me, got into her Porsche Cayenne, and drove off the property, just like that. No apology, no acknowledgement, just gone. The way people leave when they know they've done something indefensible and have decided the best response is speed. Sylvia came out last. She stood on the front steps of her own house, the house that her late husband built, that she has ruled from for 31 years, that every member of this family orbits like a moon, and she looked at my car in her driveway with an expression I had never seen from her before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't remorse, it was something calculating, the way a chess player looks at the board when they realize the move they just made might have cost them the game. And then she looked at me through my windshield, and she smiled, small, careful. The kind of smile that says, "This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't over, but not for the reason she thought. Because what Sylvia Raines did not know, what no one in that family knew, was that I had spent the past 4 months very quietly and very carefully learning every single thing about the Raines family finances. Not because I was planning to leave, not yet, but because 6 months ago I found something in Garrett's home office that I was not supposed to find. Something that changed the geometry of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my in-laws, and the empire of polished surfaces and inherited wealth that I had been living inside of like a guest who had forgotten to go home. Garrett came back to the car 20 minutes later. His eyes were red, not crying, Garrett doesn't cry, but that specific redness that comes from holding emotion in a body not built to contain it. He got in the passenger seat. He looked at Sienna, who had fallen asleep with the tablets still playing. He looked at me. "I told them," he said. "I told them that if anything like this ever happens again, we're done, with all of it. The dinners, the prep weekends, the whole thing." "And what did your mother say?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "She said Sienna was being difficult." I nodded. I put the car in reverse. I drove us home through the Atlanta night, through the lit-up streets of Buckhead, past the wine bars and the boutiques and the couples walking dogs that cost more than some people's rent. I drove home and I put Sienna to bed, and I kissed her forehead, and I stood in the doorway of her room for a long time looking at her. My daughter. My child who had been told she was annoying and put outside like an inconvenience. My 5-year-old who thought Grandma Sylvia was a normal grandmother because she had nothing to compare her to. I stood there and I made myself a promise, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken out loud to be real. What I had found in Garrett's office 6 months ago was a phone, not his regular phone, a second one, and the texts on that phone told a story about my marriage, my mother-in-law, and a secret that had been kept from me since before our wedding day. A secret so clean and so cruel that when I finally understood the full shape of it, I sat on the floor of that home office for 40 minutes and didn't make a single sound. I hadn't told anyone what I'd found, not my best friend Priya, who would have told me to leave immediately and meant it with love, not my sister Danielle, who has hated Garrett's family since our wedding rehearsal dinner when Sylvia called her dress spirited, not my therapist, because some things you need to sit with yourself first, alone, in the dark, until you know exactly what you're going to do with them. I had been sitting with it for 6 months, learning, preparing, building something that couldn't be knocked down by charm or money or the Raines family's considerable network of people who owed them favors. And the afternoon I found my daughter on that pavement, cold and alone and told she was annoying, that was the afternoon I decided I was done sitting. The afternoon I decided it was time to move. What nobody in the Raines family understood about me, what they had spent 6 years underestimating, was that I am my mother's daughter. And my mother, Loretta Calloway, grew up in Decatur with nothing, put herself through Georgia State on scholarships and waitressing shifts, became a corporate paralegal, and raised 2 daughters alone after my father left. My mother taught me that the most powerful thing a woman can be is the one in the room who knows more than everyone thinks she knows. She called it being the quiet one. "Monica," she used to say, "the loudest person at the table almost never wins. It's the quiet one. It's always the quiet one who walks out with everything." I had been quiet for 6 years. I had smiled at Sylvia's backhanded compliments and laughed at Camille's jokes about Garrett's first wife, the ex-girlfriend who apparently everyone in the family preferred, and I had hosted Christmas parties in my house and sat at the foot of that Raines family table like a very well-dressed piece of furniture. I had been so quiet. I had been so patient. And now? Now I was done being quiet. And the thing about the quiet ones, the thing Sylvia Raines was about to learn for the very first time, is that when we finally speak, we don't just speak, we burn the whole thing down. But here's what you need to understand before part 2 of this story. What I found on that phone wasn't just an affair. That would have been painful, and I would have left, and that would have been the end of it. A clean cut. Messy, expensive, heartbreaking, but clean. What I found was something that involved not just Garrett, but his mother. Something that had been engineered, the word I keep coming back to is engineered, before I ever walked down the aisle. Something that explained why Sylvia had never accepted me, why Camille always had that small smirk when she thought I wasn't looking, why certain financial documents in our household had signatures I didn't recognize. What I found was a plan, and I had been living inside it without knowing for 6 years. And the most important thing, the thing that kept me from falling apart when I put it all together, was that the plan had a flaw, a single catastrophic flaw, and that flaw had a name, and that name was mine. Because whoever built this plan, whoever sat in a room and decided that Monica Calloway was an acceptable casualty in a long game of money and control and legacy, they forgot one thing. They forgot that I am the quiet one, and the quiet one had been watching the whole time. I pulled into our driveway and sat for a moment in the dark car, Sienna asleep in the back. I looked at the house, our house, the one with my name on the deed, the one I had decorated and filled with plants and Sunday morning light, and it took one long breath, and I thought, tomorrow it begins. The part where Monica Raines stops being quiet. The part where all 6 years of patience and all 4 months of research and all 11 minutes in that driveway come together into something that cannot be undone. The part where the Raines family finally meets the woman they thought they had managed. They had no idea what was coming. Neither did Garrett. But somebody in that family did. Somebody had been watching me the way I had been watching them. Somebody had figured out what I was doing 4 months ago, and instead of stopping me, they had been quietly, carefully helping me. And I didn't know who it was. Not yet. But I was about to find out. And when I did, it would change everything I thought I understood about who in this family was actually my enemy, and who, hiding in plain sight this whole time, had been waiting for me to wake up. Part 2. The Quiet Ones Win. I want to tell you about the morning I burned the Raines family empire down to its foundation, because it didn't happen the way you might expect. There was no screaming, no flying china, no dramatic scene in a restaurant where everyone turns to look. It happened quietly, in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta on a Thursday morning in February, with 3 lawyers present and a cup of coffee I never touched. But before I get to that morning, I need to tell you about the phone call I received 17 days after I found Sienna on that pavement. Because that phone call changed the shape of everything, and it came from the last person on earth I expected. It was 10:47 at night. Sienna was asleep. Garrett was in our bedroom on his regular phone doing what he does every night before sleep, scrolling through whatever men like Garrett scroll through when they think the workday is done. I was in the kitchen with a glass of red wine and my laptop, doing what I had been doing every night for 4 months, pulling threads. The Raines family had built their real estate empire over 3 decades, and 3 decades of transactions leave a paper trail the length of the interstate if you know where to look. I knew where to look because my mother spent 22 years as a paralegal, and I grew up watching her read contracts the way other people read novels. I had learned the language early. And in that language, the Raines family financials told a story that their dinner parties and holiday prep weekends and Royal Dalton china were designed to obscure. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, Atlanta area code. I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did. Monica, a woman's voice, low, careful. Don't say my name out loud. Garrett might hear you. I set my wine glass down. I stood up from the kitchen table. I walked to the pantry and closed the door. Who is this? I said, very quietly. Someone who's been waiting for you to start asking the right questions, the voice said. You found the phone. It was not a question. I said nothing. I know you found it because I'm the one who left it where you'd find it. I stood in my pantry surrounded by olive oil and Sienna's juice boxes, and I felt the floor shift under me the way it does in that half second before an earthquake registers, that pre-tremor moment when your body knows before your mind does. "Who are you?" I said again, very quietly. "My name is Renata Voss. I've been Sylvia Rain's personal attorney for 11 years, and about 14 months ago I was asked to draft a document that I should have refused. I didn't refuse, and I have been living with that ever since." Renata Voss. I knew that name. I'd seen it on 3 different documents in the Rains family filing system, documents I'd photographed with my phone during prep weekends when everyone was distracted with sparklers and bourbon. Her name appeared on property transfers, LLC formations, and one document I hadn't been able to fully interpret yet, a trust amendment dated 8 months before Garrett and I got married.
"What was in the document?" I asked. "A prenuptial override," Renata said. "Sylvia asked me to build a legal structure that would ensure that if Garrett's marriage, your marriage, ever ended, the primary Rains properties would transfer directly to a family trust she controls, bypassing community property laws entirely. Standard enough, except that Garrett signed it under false pretenses. He was told it was a routine estate planning update. He didn't read it carefully. He trusted his mother. He has always trusted his mother entirely too much." I was quiet for a long moment. The pantry was very small. "And the second phone?" "That was Sylvia's idea too," Renata said. "The woman on the other end of those texts is not who you think she is. It's not an affair, Monica. It's a setup. She's a woman Sylvia hired 2 years ago, a family friend from Savannah, very pretty, very willing, to build a text correspondence with Garrett that could be used in divorce proceedings to establish fault on his side, to make you look like the wronged party while Sylvia simultaneously controlled the asset transfers. If you had found the phone and gone to a divorce lawyer in a panic, you would have walked out of your marriage with almost nothing, while Sylvia's trust absorbed everything." I slid down the pantry wall and sat on the floor. Above me, a shelf of pasta and canned tomatoes. Below me, cold tile. Inside me, something that had been coiled tight for 6 years was slowly beginning to release. Not because I felt better, because I finally understood the whole picture. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. "Because I have a daughter," Renata said simply. "She's 7, and when Sylvia told Camille to take your little girl and leave her by the gate, I was told about it the next day. Sylvia mentioned it at their Monday call. She laughed about it. She said Sienna was becoming a problem child, and that the sooner you and Garrett separated, the better for everyone." Renata paused. "I have watched Sylvia Rains do a lot of things over 11 years. I have helped her do some of them, but I will not watch a grown woman laugh about leaving a 5-year-old alone on a cold driveway and do nothing. I have my limits." "What do you want in return?" I asked, because nothing in the Rains orbit comes without a price. "I want out," Renata said, "clean. I want to resign without consequences. I want the document I drafted buried, and I want my name kept out of whatever you do next. In exchange, I will send you everything: the full trust amendment, the correspondence with the woman from Savannah, the LLC structure, the property transfer schedule, everything I have." She paused. "And Monica, there's one more thing. Something I found when I was reviewing the trust documents last month, something Sylvia doesn't know I found." "Tell me," I said. What Renata told me next, sitting there on my pantry floor in the dark, was the piece that cracked the whole story open, the piece that explained why Sylvia had targeted me from the beginning, why I had been chosen specifically, Why a woman with a son as eligible as Garrett Rains had allowed him to marry a girl from Decatur with a paralegal mother and no family money, when every instinct in Sylvia's body should have pushed for someone from old Atlanta money, someone from the right circles, the right clubs, the right bloodline. I had always wondered about that. It had always been the one thing that didn't fit, and now Renata was telling me why it fit perfectly. I just hadn't been looking at it from the right angle. My father, whom I have not spoken to in 11 years, who left when I was 14, who I have not thought about in any serious way since my 20s, my father had once been a business partner of Sylvia's late husband, Richard Rains. They had co-developed 2 commercial properties in South Atlanta in the early 90s. There had been a dispute, a financial one. Richard Rains had won, through means that Renata described as legally sound but not exactly clean. My father had walked away with almost nothing. He had spent years trying to recoup what he believed he was owed, and had never succeeded, and had eventually left the city, left the state, left his family, in what I had always understood as simple abandonment, but now understood might have had a shape to it that I had never been told. And Sylvia Rains had known exactly who I was when Garrett brought me home. She had recognized my last name, Calloway, immediately. She had smiled that carved smile and said, "What a lovely girl," and had never once indicated that she knew my father's name, or my father's history, or the debt she believed the Calloway family was still carrying. She had let Garrett fall in love with me. She had let us get engaged, and then she built a legal structure designed to ensure that no matter how the marriage ended, I walked away with nothing. Not because she hated me,
Because she was collecting on an old score. Because in Sylvia Rains' mind, a Calloway girl had no business inheriting Rains' money. Not a dime, not a brick, not a single square foot of the empire her husband had built, partly, in her mind, by being smarter than a man named Calloway. I sat on that pantry floor for a long time after Renata hung up, and then I got up. And I went to my laptop, and I spent the rest of that night building the case that would, 17 days later, land me in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown tower with 3 lawyers and an untouched cup of coffee. Here is what I had by the time I walked into that room. The full prenuptial override, courtesy of Renata's encrypted file transfer, documentation of the fraudulent text correspondence, including a signed statement from the woman in Savannah herself, who, it turned out, had not been paid what she was promised and was more than willing to talk to the right attorney. Financial records showing that 2 of the Rains LLCs had been structured with Garrett as a nominal partner, while Sylvia retained actual control, a fact that had tax implications Garrett's personal accountant had apparently never been shown. And one more thing, one quiet, devastating thing that I had found myself in the last 10 days by following a thread Renata hadn't even noticed she'd given me. The property dispute between Richard Rains and my father back in the early 90s, it had produced a judgment, a legal judgment, on the books that had never been fully satisfied. My father's attorneys at the time had filed a lien that had been technically dismissed, but had never been properly cleared from one of the original properties. That property had since been developed, sold, resold, and folded into the Rains family trust. But the original lien, dusty, forgotten, 20-some-odd years old, was still there if you knew where to look. And I knew where to look, because I am my mother's daughter, and my mother spent 22 years reading property records. I'm not going to tell you that lien was worth millions. It wasn't. What it was worth was leverage. The specific kind of leverage that when placed in front of the right attorney on the 42nd floor of a midtown tower makes everyone in the room go very, very still. Garrett was there.
I had told him 3 days before the meeting that we needed to talk to lawyers together, that there were things about our financial situation he didn't know and needed to understand before he could make any decisions about our future. I did not tell him about the override. I did not tell him about the woman from Savannah. I did not tell him about any of it, because Garrett Rains needed to hear it for the first time in a room with attorneys present, where his reactions would be witnessed and documented. I know how that sounds, but I had spent 6 years in a family that operated on the principle that private conversations can always be denied. I was done having conversations that could be denied. I had also, quietly, 3 weeks before the meeting, had a very long, very honest conversation with Garrett about Sienna, about the pavement, about what his daughter had said in the car, about what it meant that his mother could laugh about it on a Monday phone call, and what that said about the environment Sienna was growing up inside of. That conversation had not gone cleanly. Garrett has spent his whole life half-blind when it comes to his mother, and half-blind men don't suddenly gain sight just because you describe what you're seeing. But something had shifted. I had watched it shift. A small, reluctant, painful shift, the way a foundation moves when the ground underneath it finally tells the truth. And I had let it shift. I had not pushed. I had let him come to it at his own pace, in his own time, because I knew what was coming, and I needed him arriving at that conference room table at least halfway toward understanding. Sylvia's attorney came into the room at 9:15, looking like a man who expected a standard divorce preliminary. He had the smooth, careful confidence of someone who had sat in rooms like this 100 times and watched women like me leave with less than they deserved. He set his briefcase down, he straightened his jacket, he looked at me across the table with the particular patience of a man who considers patience a form of winning. My attorney, a woman named Brigitte Osei, who had been recommended to me by Priya's divorce lawyer sister, and who has the calm, methodical energy of someone who has never lost a case she cared about, placed a single folder on the table in front of her. She did not open it. She looked at Sylvia's attorney and said, very pleasantly, "Thank you for coming. Before we begin, I want to give your client an opportunity to review some documents that have recently come to our attention. I think it will save everyone a great deal of time." Sylvia's attorney opened the folder. He read for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I counted. Then he closed the folder. Then he looked across the table at me with an expression I will keep inside me like a small, warm stone for the rest of my life. Because it was the expression of a man who had just realized that the woman he'd written off as the manageable party was in fact holding every single card in the deck. Garrett read the documents next. I watched his face. I had steeled myself for this part, or I thought I had. The reality of watching someone you have shared a life absorb the knowledge that his mother had spent 6 years engineering your failure is not something you can fully prepare for, even when you've had months to get ready. Garrett went pale. Then he went very still. Then he looked at me with an expression that was equal parts grief and something else, something that looked, honestly, like relief. Like a man who had been carrying a weight he didn't know had a name, and who finally understood what he'd been carrying and why it had felt so heavy for so long. He looked at his mother's attorney. "Is she aware I'm reading this right now?" Brigitte was given the opportunity to attend, Brigitte said. She declined. Garrett nodded slowly. He looked back at the documents. He looked at me. "Monica," he said, "how long have you known?" 4 months, I said. "Long enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing I had not expected him to say. The thing that, even now, when I think about it, makes something complicated move through my chest. He said, "I'm sorry." Not to the attorneys, not to the table, to me.
Directly, plainly, without the Rains family habit of dressing hard things in polished language. Just, "I'm sorry." And I believed him, and that made everything harder and also, somehow, cleaner. The settlement negotiation took 9 days. Sylvia, through her attorney, attempted 4 separate counterproposals, each one slightly more desperate than the last, each one representing the slow-motion collapse of a plan that had been built on the assumption that I was too naive, too grateful, too dazzled by marble countertops and Rains family social access to ever look closely at what was underneath. The prenuptial override was voided. It had been signed under fraudulent pretenses, and Brigitte made that argument in a way that left Sylvia's attorney with nothing to stand on. The property lien was settled for a figure that I will not disclose, but that covered Sienna's college education 3 times over, and made Sylvia Rains's Monday morning phone calls considerably quieter for a while. The woman from Savannah's statement was sealed as part of the agreement, which was the only concession I made, because she had been used too, and I am not in the business of punishing people who were also used. Renata Voss resigned from Sylvia's legal team 2 days after the meeting and opened her own family law practice in Decatur. She sent me a plant for the office I eventually went back to. I had taken a leave from my communications consulting work during this period, with a card that said only, "The Quiet Ones." I kept the plant. It's still alive. Camille called me once, about 3 weeks after the settlement. I let it go to voicemail. She said she wanted to apologize, that she hadn't realized how serious it was, that she hoped we could... I deleted it before she finished the sentence. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple, clean understanding that some apologies come too late and too small for the harm that made them necessary. Sienna did not need an aunt who thought of her as annoying. We were fine without her. Sylvia Rains, and this is the part people always want to know, never called, never sent a message, never appeared at our door, which, honestly, is the most Sylvia Rains thing she could have done. She retreated into her estate and her Royal Doulton china and her prep weekends with the grandchildren she had always preferred, and she did what women like Sylvia do when their plans come apart. She pretended it hadn't happened. She rewrote the story inside her own head until she was the wronged party in it. I know this because Garrett's youngest brother, Theo, who had quietly opposed his mother for years in ways none of us had known about, told us. Theo, it turned out, had been the one person in that family who had never trusted Sylvia's management of things, who had watched her for years with the quiet, careful eyes of someone who knows the house is built wrong but can't afford to say so yet. Theo was, I slowly understood, the reason certain documents had been slightly easier to find than they should have been. Not Renata alone. Theo, too. My silent ally inside the walls.
Garrett and I did not divorce. I know that surprises people when they hear the story, but let me explain it the way I've explained it to myself, because it matters. What Sylvia had tried to do required 2 things to work. It required Garrett to be kept ignorant, and it required me to be too trusting to look. When both of those conditions were removed, when Garrett knew and I had looked, what we found underneath the manipulation was a marriage that was actually worth something. Imperfect, requiring more honesty than we'd practiced, requiring Garrett to have some very hard conversations with his own psychology about the woman who raised him, but worth something. We started therapy together. We moved Sienna to a new school where she thrived immediately, the way children thrive when they're in an environment that treats them like they matter. We spent one Christmas, just the 3 of us, in a rented house in Tybee Island, and it was the best holiday of my life. No prep weekend, no Royal Doulton, no sparklers for other children while mine sat in the cold by the gate. I went back to my consulting work in the spring, and I was better at it than I had ever been, because I had spent a winter learning that I was more capable than I had allowed myself to believe.
I hired 2 junior consultants. I took on clients I had been afraid to pursue before. I stopped making myself smaller in rooms where Rain's family money had always implied I should take less space. I started taking up exactly as much space as I deserved. It turns out that's a lot. And Sienna, my Sienna, who is now 6 and speaks in complete paragraphs and has opinions about everything from breakfast cereal to cloud formations, Sienna does not remember the pavement. Children are merciful that way. She does not remember the cold or the gate or being told she was annoying. What she remembers is that after that weekend, her mama seemed different. "You got brave, Mama," she told me one evening in the bathtub, completely unprompted, the way children say true things, just fratly, just cleanly, like it's the most obvious fact in the world. I sat with that for a long time. I got brave. Yes, something like that. The Rains family empire did not collapse. I want to be clear about that because I am not interested in stories where the revenge is total destruction. Total destruction is loud and it's satisfying for about 10 minutes, and then it's just rubble and everyone in it is covered in dust, including you. What happened was more surgical. The prenuptial override was gone, the property settlement was paid, 2 of the LLC structures were restructured in ways that gave Garrett, and by extension our family, significantly more actual control over assets that had been held in Sylvia's trust in all but name. The empire continued, but its architecture had changed, and Sylvia Rains, sitting at the head of her holiday table with her carved smile and her royal Doulton, knew it. She knew exactly what had been moved and what it meant, and she would spend the rest of her days knowing that she had built a plan to manage a girl from Decatur, and the girl from Decatur had outmaneuvered her so cleanly that there wasn't even a scar to show where the blade had gone in. That, I think, is the particular justice I was after. Not ruin, not noise, not a scene at a prep weekend that everyone could dismiss as drama. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in property records and voided documents, and the specific silence of a conference room when someone opens a folder and realizes the game is already over. The kind that lasts. The kind that a woman who spent 31 years believing her money made her untouchable will feel every single morning for the rest of her life when she looks at a balance sheet and knows, really knows, that she was bested. By the quiet one. By the girl she tried to discard. My mother, Loretta Calloway, cried when I told her the full story. Not from sadness. She cried the way women cry when something has been set right that was wrong for a long time. That specific release. The kind that comes from finally being able to put down a thing you'd been carrying without realizing it. "Your father," she said, "all those years." And I held her hand and I told her what I believe, what this whole experience had carved into me like something permanent. The wrong doesn't always get undone. Sometimes the debt doesn't get paid in the generation that ran it up. Sometimes it falls to the daughter, and sometimes the daughter, if she is careful and patient and very, very quiet, walks into a room 42nd floors above the city her grandmother grew up in with nothing, and she collects every single dime. Not for revenge, for truth, for the record, for a little girl who was told she was annoying and is going to grow up knowing exactly who her mother is. I kept the house, I kept my name, I kept my daughter, I kept my marriage, rebuilt, reordered, more honest than it had ever been. I kept everything that mattered, and Sylvia Rains kept her prep weekends and her carved smile and the specific loneliness of a woman who has spent her whole life believing control was the same thing as love. They are not the same thing. They never were. And now she knows, really knows, because the only person she ever truly tried to control looked her in the eyes through a windshield on a cold November evening and made a quiet promise, and then kept it, every single word. The quiet ones. It's always the quiet ones. We win last, but we win.
Quick check-in, where are you watching from? Drop it below and make sure to subscribe for upcoming stories. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. A new story is coming soon. Until then, stay strong and don't lose hope.